Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is September 12th, 2024, Thursday, September 12th, 2024, and we're off to the races. And our first story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Mask of Terror. For 14 years, this mask of terror was what children saw as they were stolen from their homes by a depraved predator known as the Beast of Jersey. The island of Jersey in the British Channel off the coast of Normandy is a British Crown dependency in the English Channel. It all started in 1957 when a nurse waiting at a bus stop at Monte l'Abbé was approached by a man wearing a long coat with a scarf over his face. He beat her over the head, tied a rope around her neck, and raped her in a nearby field. She was severely injured during the attack and was eventually found and taken to a hospital. In December 1957, what was dubbed as Jersey's Man in Black struck a third time by knifing a nurse, Adele Cudlip, 3 times while she was returning to her home at St. Helier. There was another attack in October 1959. The victims all described the same man. He was about 5 feet 6 inches in height, in his mid-40s, and had a strange Irish accent, which they believed was fake. He also had a strange musty smell. Police agreed the perpetrator was the same man. On this small island, it appeared that a nightmare had come to life when children were terrorized and kidnapped by a man wearing a rubber mask and a black wig. He would creep into their homes during the full moon, and then he would tie a noose around their necks and molest them sexually. In some instances, he would truss his victims like farm animals by tying their hands to their ankles. On February 14, 1960, a man went into a bedroom where a 12-year-old boy slept. When the child woke up, he saw a man in a mask standing at the foot of his bed who shone a flashlight into his eyes and blinded him. The man placed a noose around his neck and dragged him outside to a field where he raped him. After it was over, he took him back into the house and disappeared. Edward John Lewis Peisnell was caught in 1971. During the sensational trial that followed, it was revealed he followed in the footsteps of the notorious Guy de Rais, a soldier, sadist, and pedophile who once fought with Joan of Arc. De Rais brought children to his castle where he tortured them and offered them as a sacrifice to the devil. In a barn on his property, Peisnell had erected an altar to Satan that he hid behind red curtains. It was decorated with occult symbols and other arcane items. He would sacrifice small animals in a blood ritual before going out for the night to claim another victim. A secret room was also found at Peisnell's house, concealed behind a hinged cupboard, which was hidden behind a curtain. There police found a large wooden-bladed knife hanging over a glass chalice. There was also a china toad. Peisnell was captured when he stole a car and came to a police roadblock investigating another murder. Convinced they were looking for him, he ran through the roadblock and a red light, leading the police on a 75-mile-per-hour chase until he crashed at a bend and was tackled by an officer as he fled. He had no need to confess since he was wearing his beast costume, which consisted of a long overcoat with inch-long nails studding the lapels and shoulders. He had nail-studded bracelets on his wrists, and on his head was a black wig. Inside a coat pocket was the rubber mask. Police also found 2 lengths of sash cord, a pajama cord, and other articles. Peisnell explained he was going to an orgy. When asked about the wig, he said he used it as a disguise at a secret society meeting he attended. The sex orgies occurred during the religious meeting. After Peisnell's arrest, a girl told the courts that 5 years before, a masked man raped her while she was on holiday on the island. After hearing 2 minutes of a tape with Peisnell's voice, she said, "That is the voice of the man who attacked me. The voice is the one thing that will stick in my mind." One of the attacks occurred in July 19, 1964. The victim was a 10-year-old girl, and Peisnell entered the home through the kitchen window. He took her from the house, wrapped in a household rug, and carried her to a field 200 yards away near a road called the Devil's Chair. There he sexually assaulted her. Peisnell was convicted on 13 counts of assault, rape, and sodomy in December 1971 and sentenced to 30 years in prison. The children attacked were between the ages of 9 and 16. One of those victims was even impregnated by Peisnell. Another witness confirmed he used chloroform on sleeping children. Peisnell's attorney, Tom Dorr, in his closing speech said that more than one person was responsible for the attacks on the children. During the trial, Peisnell's mother, Alice Maud Peisnell, gave evidence for the defense. She testified that on the night of August 6, 1966, the date of an alleged sexual attack on a 15-year-old girl, he was watching TV with her and his father, Emil Peisnell. He stayed there until the early hours of the morning. Peisnell's mistress, Florence Hawkins, a nurse, who testified for the defense, wept at his trial and sobbed when he was convicted. "Please, please, I must be near him." It's believed the Beast of Jersey was also responsible for a number of unsolved missing children cases. Testimony from neighbors proved that Peisnell led a double life for years. He was known as a pillar of society and a skilled builder who went by the name of Ted. He lived with his wife Joan and 3 children at Maison du Soleil, Bouleveau-Grouvelle, Jersey. His wife Joan founded a community home, and the couple would take in orphan children at their home in Grouvelle. They had their own 3 children. Ironically, he played Santa Claus during the Christmas season. Like many psychopaths, he urged the local authorities to capture the criminal who was attacking children, knowing full well he was the author of these crimes. Prior to Peisnell's arrest, the first to be suspected in the crimes was a fisherman and farmer named Alphonse Legastellois. He was arrested but released for lack of evidence. This did not satisfy the townspeople, and his cottage was burned down in an obvious act of arson. Legastellois, fearing for his life, went to Le Creux in a self-imposed exile that lasted 14 years. Legastellois, known as a loner who roamed the country lanes at night, wearing a dirty raincoat tied at the waist with a piece of rope, came under suspicion due to his odd behavior. Of 30 suspects the authorities investigated, they only released his name to the public, which years later has never been understood. Even after he was cleared by the arrest of Peisnell, he continued to live at Écrou, where he survived from eating lobsters, rabbits, fish, seaweed, and seagull eggs. That's another nearby island, by the way. He returned to Jersey in 1975. He never married or had children and was looked after by his nephew when he became old. Peisnell was released from prison in 1991 after serving 20 years of his 30-year sentence. He moved to the Isle of Wight since sentiment against him was still high. He died in July 1994. Long after Peisnell was dead and memories of his crimes had faded, his name would surface once more. In February 2008, police were searching the grounds of a former children's home in Jersey after a child's remains were found in the building. They also discovered more bodies at what was once the Haut de la Garenne in St. Martin, under a concrete floor. Haut de la Garenne opened in 1867 as the industrial school for young people of the lower classes of society and neglected children. In 1900 it was renamed the Jersey Home for Boys. During the Nazi occupation it was used as a signaling station, and once the war was over it reverted to a children's home. It closed in 1987, and at that time it served about 60 people with special needs. It was refurbished and opened as a youth hostel in 2004. The discovery was a result of a 3-month investigation into child abuse at several government institutions on the island. The unearthed remains were believed to date back to the 1980s. However, the police were unable to determine how old the child was and whether it was male or female. The police had been covertly investigating and gathering statements for 1 year regarding abuse that spanned more than 40 years. The first tip as to the scale of the rampant abuse of children on the island was when the authorities were conducting a series of convictions for sexual offenses involving officers of Jersey Sea Cadets. They noticed links between the victims in those cases and other institutions on the island, including Haut de la Garenne. More than 150 people called the helpline with allegations of abuse. Police received information on 140 victims and 40 suspects that had all at one time worked at Haut de la Garenne. The allegations spanned from the end of World War II to the early 2000s. Some of the callers were as far away as Australia. The allegations ranged from pretty severe physical and mental abuse right through to the most serious sexual crimes that you can imagine. There were also questions as to why these allegations had not been presented to authorities before. Using the information gathered, police brought dogs and ground-penetrating radar to Haut de la Garenne, or Garenne. I'm saying Garenne, it might be Garenne, The radar and the dogs indicated where the archaeologists should dig. In January 2008, police charged a local resident named Gordon Claude Wateridge, 76, with the abuse of 3 girls under the age of 16, which occurred between 1969 and 1979. What police found as they conducted the investigation was instances of pedophilia that involved several personalities of responsibility. Several persons of responsibility, and that some of them had worked at Haut de la Garenne. As the investigation progressed, police realized there might be children buried on the grounds. A former minister who had been fired in September 2007 for asking questions said that if the investigators had been indigenous, none of the search would have happened. Senator Stuart Sivret handed out copies of a confidential report dating to 2000 on the activities of Andrew Jervis Dykes, a teacher at Victoria College who was jailed for abusing 6 pupils between 1979 and 1996. He claimed there was a culture of concealment within the Jersey legislature and judiciary that led to the abuse of children in different institutions where the crimes were tolerated and possibly covered up. Accusations also involved cover-ups after it emerged that several bones were found in 2003 by builders renovating the home, but the bones were deemed to belong to an animal, and the case was closed. A trapdoor, shackles, and canes were also found at that time. Police discovered that records kept at the school were sketchy, and possibly any children that were missing were reported as runaways. The police concentrated their digging at a bricked-up cellar at the back of the building where witnesses said child abuse took place. A Scottish resident who had lived on the island for 8 years said, quote, "There have been rumors of child abuse for years." Inside the bricked-up cellar, a concrete bath and a set of shackles were discovered. Another dungeon-like chamber was found beneath a trapdoor. Officers found 65 milk teeth in the basement, many belonging to older children who would have already shed them. Authorities suspected that after Haut de la Garenne closed in 1986, abuse continued in other institutions. Jersey Island measures 9 miles by 5 and had a population of 90,000 at that time. Gary Matthews, a former member of the island's parliament, said that the political classes were terrified of scandals that would bring questions and interference from the outside. The culture of secrecy started during the German occupation in the Second World War, when there was a certain amount of collaboration. Then, in the 1960s, when Jersey built up its all-important financial sector, secrecy became the rule. An example was made of the case of Roger Holland, 43, a St. John ambulance volunteer who was a convicted pedophile when he applied to become a part-time police officer in 1992. Only 6 years before, he had sexually assaulted a mentally impaired 14-year-old girl. He admitted to molesting a second child, whose parents felt she was too traumatized to press charges. Holland confessed that he had a problem for younger girls. Despite his conviction, the Jersey authorities decided this was in the past and allowed him to stand for election as a constable's officer. He was elected unopposed. Re-elected in 1995, he was promoted in 1997 to the rank of Vingtenier, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, or Vingtenier, constable's officer, the second most senior in the island's volunteer force. In 1999, a young girl alleged he had committed a sexual act with her in the back of a police van. He resigned in 1999 and in 2001 was jailed for 2 years for 2 counts of indecent assault. Edward Peisnell, the Beast of Jersey, would dress as Santa Claus and handed out sweets to the children, which he asked to call him Uncle Ted. He was one of the guests at the horrific parties held in the home where both boys and girls were tortured and raped. It has been claimed during public evidence that Peisnell regularly visited La Préférence, a home run by his mother-in-law to abuse young residents. There were many reports of someone moving around in the crawl spaces at night during the 1960s, which is believed was Peisnell. The inquiry later heard from a witness who was born in 1990 and stayed at La Préférence in the early 2000s. He claimed that he was physically assaulted by a man who worked for social services. A witness referred to as Mr. D claimed he would occasionally stay at the home of the Peisnells to help with building work during his time at La Préférence. He claimed that Joan Peisnell would beat him and appeared to take sexual pleasure from doing so, stating that she would go red in the face with enjoyment. Ironically, Joan Paisnell authored a book titled The Beast of Jersey shortly after her husband's arrest and conviction, as if to separate herself from his deeds. But in truth, was she ever questioned as to how much she knew of what he was doing? Another question asked was how, on such a small island, did so many hundreds of children end up in care homes? Poverty was listed as the most contributing factor. In 2012, Wilfred Bramble, an actor who played the dirty old man Albert Steptoe in the BBC comedy Steptoe and Son, was accused of abusing two boys in a theater on the island of Jersey at the height of his fame in the 1970s. Bramble was homosexual and had a criminal record for, quote, persistently inopportuning for an immoral purpose, end quote, in a public lavatory at Shepherd's Bush, West London, dating back to 1962. The victims, who are now adults, said they did not report the abuse because they did not trust the island's constabulary. One of the tormentors at Haut de la Garenne was Jimmy Savile. After his death, police concluded he had been one of Britain's most prolific predatory sex offenders. There were allegations during his lifetime, but like the cases at Haut de la Garenne, accusations were dismissed, ignored, or disbelieved. Savile also abused children at Sacré-Cœur orphanage on the island, which was run by French Catholic nuns. At the end of the investigation at Haut de la Garenne, it was found that of 170 bone fragments recovered, only 3 could be human and probably dated back centuries. However, the investigation, codenamed Operation Rectangle, did unearth an extensive scandal of sexual and physical abuse at the school and other Jersey orphanages. 8 people were prosecuted for 145 offenses and 7 were convicted. Some of the offenders had already died. At the end of the investigation, the police had collected more than 500 claims of offenses. Wilfrid Krzyzewski, a Jersey senator and TV executive who had already died, was named as an abuser posthumously. The Channel Islands were the only part of the British Isles to be occupied during the war, remaining under German control for 5 years until they were liberated in May 1945. One man, Giffard Aubin, told the Inquiry he was taken into care during the occupation when his father complained about a local brothel frequented by the Germans. He told the Inquiry the complaint was based onto a Jersey centenier, an honorary policeman who declared that Aubin's father was an unfit parent. Another man described where his father was deported to Germany and he was caught stealing to feed his family. As a consequence, he was sent into care. Children fathered by German troops were sent into care as well. At the Sacré-Cœur orphanage, one woman said, if a child wet the bed, they would be put on a chair with their pants on their head. The other children would be then told to form a circle around the child, and the nuns would lead a rhyme in French, ridiculing them. Another woman said she was abused by Savile at the orphanage in 1969. She said she reported to a nun, but had her mouth washed out with soap and was told never to speak to anyone about it. The Sacré-Cœur orphanage, or Sacré-Cœur orphanage, was opened for 70 years before there was any state inspection. A home run by the Vegetarian Society, who punished children caught eating meat, was only inspected once in 1981 after it had been open for 33 years. In 2017, there were calls to demolish Haut de la Garenne, which had been dubbed the House of Horror. In 2018, it was decided not to raise it. The school was used as a set for the BBC series Bergerac that aired from 1981 to 1991 on BBC One. The questions begged to be asked. How a man could terrorize a community for 14 years on an island that measures only 9 miles by 4 miles in the 1950s when it was inhabited by only 30,000 inhabitants? How could such a small, inconspicuous place become the hub of pedophiles throughout the years, without fear of discovery, or so it seems? Was it really a coincidence that Paisnell used Gilles de Rais as his muse? Perhaps there were many beasts on Jersey. Now, you know what? When you read this was a 955. This is a small area. And even during the attacks where Paisnell was supposedly doing, well, no, not supposedly, he did do these things. 30,000 people, and I can't understand. There's a part of me that thinks, how was he getting these kids out of the house? Because I would hear anything. I don't know, there's something there that just doesn't add up. And it almost seems like, for lack of a better word, again, so many orphans, and almost like the word got out among the pedophiles. Hey, you want to hook up with the kid? Go to go to Jersey, and don't worry. The cops will take care of it. Everybody in the food chain is going to make sure you're covered. That's a very sad story, but unfortunate. But I think that happens in a lot of places. Anyway, on to the next story, and this one is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled "Who Haunts White Rock Lake?" One of the most famous apparitions is a hitchhiking white lady seen on the shores of White Rock Lake in Dallas, Texas. Who was she? And is she the only one who haunts this place? Bison herds once roamed across White Rock Valley, which was part of the Blackland Prairie. White Rock Lake, located in northeast Dallas, Texas, was formed after the White Rock Creek was dammed. The reservoir flooded over farms owned by the Cox and Daniel families who settled there in the 1830s and 1840s. The only thing left of the Cox and Daniel farms is the Cox Cemetery. The Daniel family fell on hard times, and the renovation funds contributed by the Cox family earned it a new name. Other pioneer families buried there are the Glovers, the Humbards, Lavenders, McComases, and Donaghys. Approximately 500 people are interred there. The dam was completed in 1911, and through the years, a bathhouse, a dancing pavilion, and boathouses were constructed. In 1935, the Civilian Conservation Corps built structures at Winfrey Point and planted hundreds of trees. During World War II, it was turned into a boot camp for 2 years. In 1944, it was a prisoner of war camp, which held over 400 German non-combatants who had served under Rommel and were captured in the North Africa campaign. People came to fish, swim, and boat on the reservoir, which spans a little over 1,000 acres. In 1952, swimming was banned. The Lady of White Rock Lake is an urban myth connected to the area, and like many tales of this type, she is described in different ways. In one instance, she is a 20-something girl wearing a 1930s-era evening dress. The consensus is that she met her end in a night boating accident or a car accident. Cited as a lonely girl trudging along the roadside of East Lawther Drive, she has to be taken to a house on Gaston Avenue. Sometime during the trip, she disappears, leaving only a witness where she sat. She has also appeared on lake-fronting porches where she asked to use a telephone before disappearing. Another version describes her as a beautiful girl with short black hair wearing a wedding dress. She tells a driver who stopped for her that her name is Jill Walters and gives him the address of 720 Island Way, just 5 minutes from where he picked her up. Other times it's an address on Gaston Avenue, a street that leads to the lake. She disappears, and the Good Samaritan who gave her a ride arrives at the address only to find out she drowned 2 years before at the lake, the day before she was to get married. Like many of these ghost stories, an alternate storyline is that she died when her ex-boyfriend drove off into the lake when she told him she was marrying another man. In 1943, Ann Clark, on behalf of the Texas Folklore Society's publication Backwoods to Border, wrote the story The Ghost of White Rock. In this retelling, a young couple is parked on the shore of the lake. When they switch on the headlights, they see a young woman dressed in a sheer white wet dress walking towards them. She tells them her boat overturned and she must get home. The others are safe. The address she gives is in the town of Oak Cliff. However, before long, she disappears, leaving only a wet seat. They go to the address she gave them, and a man tells him his daughter drowned 3 weeks before while sailing on White Rock Lake. In yet another version, the person living at the home tells the puzzled motorist they've described a woman who lived in the house many years before, but she drowned in the lake. In 1953, Frank X. Tolbert tells of a night when Guy Malloy, who was director of a display for Neiman Marcus, is accompanied by his wife Josephine. They see a blonde girl standing on the beach. She asks them to be taken to Gaston Avenue. Suddenly she disappears, and when they come to the address, a man tells them his daughter died 2 years before when she fell off a pier at White Rock Lake. The story was later embellished where she was wearing a Neiman Marcus dress, but the original story had the girl dressed in a raincoat. Malloy had one of the first homes at White Rock Lake. Was the Lady of White Rock based in fact? It's not certain how far back the sightings of the White Lady go, but many believe it started in the 1930s. Here are some women that found sudden death or were quite unhappy when they were alive. In 1927, Hallie Enid Gaston, 19, drowned in the lake after her boat capsized. It's worth noting her surname of Gaston. If she is the hitchhiking lady, was she telling the driver her name and not the street? In 1935, Louis Ford Davis drowned herself at the lake. She was married to Earl H. Davis, but the one who found her suicide note was her sister Esther Doyle, who called police within minutes of discovering the note. They sent 7 squad cars but found her bobbing in the water, and they could not resuscitate her. In November 1942, a fisherman found a coat and a hat with a note pinned to them on the shore of the lake. The items belonged to Nora Rose Stone, 37, and she asked that a sister in Fort Worth be notified. Police dragged waters near the public boathouses in search of her body. Her relatives came to help police, and according to the newspapers, they said she had been in poor health recently and her husband was in the army. A day later, her corpse was recovered. Now the story had changed. There was no mention made of a husband, in the army or otherwise, and Stone was her maiden name. Her sister said she had recently returned from Washington because she had been in ill health. Later reports were that she was a stenographer working for the government who had a nervous breakdown. Her death certificate listed her as divorced. She had married Cleve Bowers McCormick in 1930. If there was an exact reason why she took her life, it was never revealed. Perhaps it had something to do with her ex-husband Cleve, who had led quite a peculiar life. Cleve Bowers McCormick was born in 1892 in the small town of Zwall, Louisiana. He married his first wife, Pearl Richardson, in 1912. By 1917, the marriage seemed to be over since he made the papers after he was sued for a marriage annulment from his second wife because he promised her, when she was his fiancée, a $2,000 diamond ring, among other things. Garnet McCormick, a picture theater cashier in Oklahoma, said her husband, a soldier at Fort Sill, had threatened her that if she failed to marry him, he would prosecute her and her family legally since he had procured a marriage license. She described him as, quote, eccentric and with a violent disposition, end quote. He told her that unless she would consent to marry him, he would kill her and himself. He also represented himself as a man of wealth and promised a diamond engagement ring. Later, she found out he earned $33 a month as a soldier's salary and that he owned no property. She did not live with him for the 3 months it took to procure the annulment. Cleve married the unhappy Nora Stone, wife number 3, around 1930, and in the 1940 census they were still living together. Sometime after this, they divorced. In 1946, Elizabeth McCormick, wife number 4, divorced Cleve. Nothing was known about the circumstances, however, she was the one that petitioned it. His last marriage was to Martha Shaw. In 1954, he was found dead inside his car parked near the Veterans Hospital. He was a watchman for a construction company, and it was determined he died from a heart attack. At first, it was suspected to be a suicide. He seemed an odd fellow, to say the least, and perhaps part of the ghost story that involves a vengeful boyfriend that refuses to end the relationship is based on him. Cleve McCormick had his own sad family history. His father, Johnny McCormick, a Sabine Parish marshal, was killed in a street duel in 1898 when he was 26 years old. This swath of Zwale, Louisiana was known as No Man's Land, a haven for outlaws. He was attempting to arrest Nicanor Sepulveda, who was raising a disturbance. He resisted, pulled a pistol, and at close range shot McCormick in the stomach. The constable then pulled his pistol and fired 3 bullets into Sepulveda, killing him on the spot. But let's not lay all the hauntings at the feet of the lady. There might be more than one ghost there. In 1926, a year before Hallie Gaston drowned, Joseph Jaworski, the son of a prominent Waco family, was discovered floating under a pier at White Rock Lake. The 25-year-old engineer had been missing for 3 days. It was alluded that it was an accident, but since his father was a minister, a suicide could possibly have been covered up. In May 1929, 3 high school boys drowned in a lake after their boat overturned. They had been fishing. In 1941, the body of Louis David, a former convict, was found killed gangland style. Riddled with 5 shots, he was found near White Rock Lake. In 1948, Mrs. Maurice Marriott, 40, fell from a motorboat and drowned. She had clutched the life preserver thrown to her, but then went under. In 1953, Russell Gardner, 21, drowned after jumping from his motorboat before it exploded. In 1964, Samuel C. Turney, 51, was recovered from White Rock Lake. Like Norstone, he left clothes, a wallet, and a note on the shore. That same year, a construction company foreman was killed when he fell beneath a tread tractor at a road project near White Rock Lake. He was 29 years old. The mystery of who is the lady might never be solved. And if not, she perhaps keeps good company from those that met their end at White Rock Lake just like her. So, this is part like a ghost story with a hitchhiking ghost, which you hear all over the place. But God knows enough stuff happened there that it's not surprising that there's a couple of supposed ghosts, let's say apart from the hitchhiking part. Very interesting. Okay, the other story also is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and this is titled Sunken Ships and Tales of Treasure. Shipwrecks and treasure have inspired adventurers through the years. Whether it's the hunt or the hunger for riches, it's an obsession that can last a lifetime. Some ships have been found, others not. However, they all share an air of mystery that haunts the imagination. The first ship is the Cuca. The ship was constructed in 1889 and was christened the A. Stewart. These barges were usually towed behind steamships, and the A. Stewart worked in tandem with the Buell as they hauled lumber mostly out of upstate New York. In 1927, Captain James Galler of the Wolverine Steamship Company bought both boats and moved them to Boyne City, Michigan. The A. Stewart was renamed to the Cuca, and the Buell became the Elmira. He tried hauling lumber with them, but the ships were in need of repair, so he moved them to Boyne City, Michigan. The Elmira burned down at the Boyne City dock in 1930, and the Cuca was converted into a party boat that in the summer would be towed around the lake, but then would be moored back at Boyne City. The Cuca was advertised as a floating pavilion with a dance floor that measured 95 feet by 30 feet. There was a restaurant and also an orchestra. The steamship Ocean Bedell towed it from town to town and then offshore. The ship was supposedly supplied by Al Capone with booze during Prohibition. Illegal gambling and drinking catered to the common folk of the area. Once passengers were picked up from the dock, it drifted off to the middle of the lake, making it difficult for police to raid the place. Rumors, though, were that authorities were paid off to look the other way. Despite its popularity as she toured around the lake, she was badly in need of repair and had to be pumped out daily. The caretaker, which was to take care of this, was paid in whiskey. The beginning of the end started on December 30th, 1930. Edward Latham, a manager for the casino, was shot in the stomach when he stepped between two patrons, Ellsworth and Ballant, a 22-year-old flyer, and an unnamed man who were fighting on board the ship. It was Ballant who did the shooting. Latham was taken to the hospital in critical condition, and the law caught up to Ballant 2 days later. What became of Ed Latham is unknown, but in 1955, Ellsworth Ballant was operating a passenger airplane service from Emmett County Airport. His plane, the Spirit of Petoskey, made runs into lower Michigan. After the shooting, Captain Gallagher shut down the Cuca. On August 14, 1932, she mysteriously sank in about 50 feet of water. There are several rumors as to how the Cuca ended up at the bottom of the lake. They were: the city's leading ladies that belonged to the Women's Christian Temperance Union had it sunk. The old ship was more liability than anything else, and the owner wanted to get rid of it and away from the attention of the revenuers, aka the IRS. Or, according to Lowton Wilson, 82, a one-time sax player on the dance boat, who said in a 1991 interview that a boiler fire was to blame. Soon after her demise, the mast and the ship were dynamited since they were considered a hazard. Measuring close to 200 feet in length and 2 stories in height, the uppermost part of the vessel is visible just 15 feet below the surface. Throughout the years, it became a favorite diving spot, and scavengers took souvenirs. The wooden rudder was brought to the surface and became the piano bar top at the Weather Vane restaurant. It's since been sold and its whereabouts are unknown. In 1960, Anthony Robbins, 23, drowned while skin diving to see the Cuca. He was with a group of divers, and it was believed he suffered a cramp. Robin was to have been married the following month. And there's there's a lot of mysterious ships in the Great Lakes. The next ship is the Santa Maria. In August 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail with a crew of 86 men from southern Spain. He had 3 ships under his command, La Santa Clara or the Niña, La Pinta, and La Santa Gallega or the Santa Maria. The Santa Maria was the cargo and flagship of the 3. The other 2 were small and swift and known as caravels, each carrying less than 30 crewmen apiece. On December 24, 1492, the helmsman on the Santa Maria left a cabin boy at the wheel so he could take a nap. Unsurprisingly, the ship sailed into a reef on the coast of what would become Haiti on Christmas Day. Crewmen and Taino natives helped to empty the hold. They also took timbers from it to build Villa de la Navidad, the first Spanish settlement in the New World. The hull of the vessel sank the following day. Columbus named the island Hispaniola. With only 2 caravels left to sail back to Spain, he left 39 of the crew behind. Upon his return, a year later, he found the fort destroyed with no sign of any inhabitants. It was presumed they were massacred by one of the tribes. They could have also been victims of disease or internal fighting. There might be different reasons why the Santa Maria has not been found. The warm waters in which it sank is rife with shipworms known as the termites of the sea. They eat exposed wooden wrecks in the span of 10 years. There were also innumerable hurricanes that passed over the island throughout the years. Due to storms and land use, the coastlines have changed. For over 500 years, the location of the Santa Maria has eluded underwater explorers. A discovery in 2014 turned out to be a ship of the 17th century. So, as of today, what's known as the Holy Grail of shipwreck remains undiscovered. The next ship is called the Flower of the Seed, or Flor do Mar, or Flor de la Mar. Depends if you say it in Spanish or Portuguese. She was a large 3-masted carrack built for rough seas and long voyages. She had 50 guns and a crew of 500 men. Built in 1502, her purpose was to traverse the route known as Carrera da India, used by the Portuguese Indian armadas to carry officials, troops, missionaries, colonists, and to engage in the spice trade. On her maiden voyage, she sprung a leak around Cape Corrientes along the Mozambique Channel and had to stop at Mozambique Island for repairs. She was loaded with spices and didn't return to Portugal until 1503. She became one of 22 ships which made up the 7th Portuguese India Fleet. On the return trip, she again was forced to anchor Mozambique for repairs that took 10 months. Her large size and weight made her hard to maneuver in the fast currents of the Mozambique Channel. Her commander, João de Nova, tried repeatedly to take her out, but the heavily laden ship would spring another leak, and he was forced to turn back for more repairs. Due to the problems encountered by the Flor de la Mar, captains of heavily laden large ships were ordered to avoid returning via the fast Mozambique Channel, but rather sail a longer but calmer course east of Madagascar known as the Outer Route. In 1506, a fleet of 15 Portuguese ships were sent to conquer the island of Socotra and close the trade to the Red Sea. They arrived in Mozambique and integrated the Flor de la Mar into the fleet. They unloaded her cargo onto another Portugal-bound ship. The Flor de la Mar was never to dock in Portugal again. Between 1506 and 1511, the ship was part of the effort to conquer the cities of Curiati, Corfacam, Ormuz, Kalat, Sohar, Goa, and Malacca. In 1511, Mahmud Shah, as the Sultan of Malacca, fled to the Malay Peninsula. The Flor de la Mar was loaded with all the treasures left behind in the royal palace and set out for the court of King Manuel in Lisbon. It's believed part of the cargo was a tribute from the King of Siam, along with the personal fortune of Alfonso de Albuquerque, who commanded the squadron of ships. Part of this was the bracelet of the Raja of Sabandar. Alfonso de Albuquerque, first Duke of Goa, was a Portuguese general, admiral, and statesman. He served as Viceroy of Portuguese India from 1509 to 1515, during which he expanded Portuguese influence across the Indian Ocean and built a reputation as a fierce and skilled military commander. A storm caught the ship in the Strait of Malacca and wrecked it on some shoals. It broke in two, and Albuquerque survived by clinging to a raft, but most of the crew drowned. As to what happened to the immense treasure, there are different stories. Later, Albuquerque wrote, quote, "The monies in gold, silver, copper, and tin are coined in Malacca. Much of the tin money was lost in the Flor de la Mar," end quote. possibility that the locals took the loot, and another that it was covered by sediment and carried out to sea. The estimated value of the treasure is $2.6 billion. Portugal, Indonesia, and Malaysia all claim salvage rights. Now, the next one is called the Cinco Chagas, the next ship, or the Five Wounds. Uh, the Cinco Chagas was a Portuguese nau, or carack, built in Goa in a dockyard known as Ribeira Grande. Remember, this is almost like 80 years, after this thing was going on with this other ship, with the Flor de la Man. All right, we're talking now 1593, and she carried a crew of 1,400. She set out on a maiden voyage in 1593 and carried a crew of 1,400, and it was believed she was overloaded and she winterized in Mozambique. It was found she was in poor condition. Goa was conquered by Alfonso de Albuquerque in 1510, and it became the capital of the Portuguese state of India. Situated on the Malabar coast, it would remain under Portuguese control until 1961. In 1594, the Cinco Chagas sunk during the Anglo-Spanish War. It was set on fire, and the English killed 500 people, sparing only 13 of the crew. They described the ship as the most rich-laden vessel to sail from the West Indies. According to the only eyewitness account available, written by Melchor Estacio del Amaral in 1604, quote, "The sea was purple with blood dripping from the scuppers, the decks cluttered with the dead, and the fire raging in some parts of the ships, and the air so filled with smoke that not only we could sometimes not see each other, but we could not recognize each other." End quote. The cargo on the ship included goods salvaged from two other ships, the Santo Alberto and Our Lady of Nazareth, along with their crews. What the Cinco Chagas carried in her hold was estimated to be more than 2 million ducats. There were also 22 treasure chests of diamonds, rubies, and pearls that present day would be worth $15 to $20 billion. The treasures were being sent to the King of Spain and Portugal. The treasure is believed to lie over 1 mile deep in the Atlantic Ocean, 18 miles south of Pico Island and Fayal. The depth of where the Cinco Chaga lies off the coast of the Azores has made it difficult to search for her. Francesco Vendramin, Venetian ambassador to Spain, came from a rich merchant family. In 1619, he would be made a cardinal. As a historian, his account of the loss of the Cinco Chagas was kept in the Italian archives. He described it this way, quote, "The trouble caused by the English is felt more acutely every day at Lisbon. A ship, the richest that ever sailed from the East Indies, was lost the other day. It was the largest of the 4 or 5 that were expected from the East India ports, and also the best armed, was laden with a cargo worth upwards of 2 million in gold, not only in pepper and drugs, but in a large quantity of oriental pearls, jewels, and other precious goods. The captain, tempted by greed, took on board 400 blacks whom he intended to sell in Spain. The heat and overcrowding brought on the plague, of which upwards of 500 persons died in 10 days. Besides the blacks, there were on board 300 passengers, chiefly Italian and Portuguese merchants. After this terrible mortality, the ship began to draw near the Azores, where she was exposed to the fire of 3 English corsairs, who followed her up for 2 whole days with a heavy cannonade. The English drew close and managed to board her with 25 men, but these were all cut to bits. Seeing there was no hope of capturing her, as she was now in sight of the Azores, the English resolved to fire with Greek fire, which was applied to many parts of the ship at once, and then uniting made a tremendous flame, in the midst of which she went down with cargo and crew, and not a thing fell into the hands of the English. I hear that the loss among only 4 of the merchants amounts to 600,000 ducats, and the total reaches 2 million. End quote. The Cinco Chagas was built at the Ribeira Grande, a dockyard in Goa. The Bom Jesus and Madre de Deus, or Deus, were built here as well. It later became known as the Arsenal de Marinha, which was situated in a greater compound, flanked on the east by the Ribeira de Gales, on the west coast by the Cais de Santa Catarina, or Quay of St. Catherine. Further west was the bustling Cais de Fortaleza de Viceroy, or Quay of the Viceroys, sandwiched between the Mandovi River and the Viceroy's Palace. The dockyard continued to function all the way until the 19th century. The dockyard excelled in constructing ships for trade and war, and aided in the Portuguese colonial expansion in the east. Jose Nicolau da Fonseca, a traveler who visited Goa in 1878, had this to say about the state of the quay of the viceroys, quote, "A luxuriant but lonely grove of palm trees stands now on the site of this once busy pier, which measured about 700 paces in length and 200 in breadth. There is nothing at present to show the once flourishing conditions of these places. Instead of the bustle that once prevailed here, complete silence now reigns, broken only by the wind whistling through the branches of the palm trees which grows luxuriantly on the spot." End quote. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And unfortunately, but from what I understand, the Santa Maria, obviously there was nothing there. You know, it's just that if you could find Columbus's flagship, the discovery in and of itself. But these other two, there was a lot of money involved in this. And the one, and especially that one off the Azores, that's a mile down. And who knows what happened to that. But yep. So there you go. Now our next story is out of Mysterious Universe, and this is titled Strange Lights, Mysterious Entities, and Alien Attacks, America's Strangest Lesser Known Ranches. While most of us here will have heard of Skinwalker Ranch, the fact is there are many other ranches across America that are, not at the very least, equally as strange and disturbing. These locations are host to all manner of paranormal entities and going-ons, ranging from ghostly apparitions, possession by animal-like spirits, and even nuts and bolts UFOs flying over and even landing on the land in question. The fact is, many ranches across the United States are home to some of the strangest, thought-provoking, and often most disturbing events on record. Perhaps the best place for us to start this potentially unsettling journey would be with the rather bizarrely named Blind Frog Ranch, not least as it resides, essentially, on the same land as its more famous neighbor, the previously mentioned Skinwalker Ranch. Located in Vernal, around 30 miles to the northeast of Ballard and Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, Blind Frog Ranch is home to an abundance of paranormal activity and strange going-ons, and these range from ominous-looking lights to mysterious entities and even bizarre energy vortexes. Also like Skinwalker Ranch, Blind Frog Ranch, or more specifically the land it sits on and within, has a long history of strange and supernatural activity, seemingly stretching back thousands of years. In fact, there have been multiple discoveries on the land, and indeed, under the ground in intricate tunnel networks, that suggest the civilization could go back much further than people think, and that they could have been a very advanced society. Many Native American legends of the area make specific mention of portals or gateways to the spirit world, a realm that some researchers have suggested could in reality be another dimension. What is further interesting about these legends is that scientific tests have returned some highly unusual readings of anomalous electromagnetic energy at Blind Frog Ranch. Could this strange energy be connected somehow to the apparent portals there? And are these portals responsible for the many strange entities and unusual activity on the ranch? We will return to this suggestion shortly. Multiple UFO sightings have occurred over or near the ranch. While many of these reports describe bizarre and unnerving lights, others describe a definite vehicle, a nuts and bolts highly advanced aerial craft. The region is so rife with UFO activity that some researchers and investigators refer to it as the new Area 51. There's certainly a plethora of other accounts of disturbing goings-on taking place at Blind Frog Ranch. Some of these involve people seeing bizarre orbs of light that appear to hover or even dance over the land. They often remain visible for several minutes before suddenly disappearing, as if into thin air. Some of these reports speak of these glowing orbs hovering directly over the ranch buildings themselves. They usually remain completely silent before shooting directly up into the sky and vanishing in an instant. A particularly interesting account involved a group of hikers who were walking through the woodland surrounding the ranch. They came to a small clearing in the woods in which they saw a strange metallic sphere approximately the size of a basketball. They cautiously approached this metal ball-like object, noting how it made a low humming sound and pulsated with white light. The group remained several feet away from the object, each of them bordering on a strange, trance-like state as they stared at it. As they did so, each began to feel strange surges of fear and anxiety take over them. These feelings would quickly morph into feelings of physical pain and discomfort. Ultimately, the group turned away from the object and made their way from it as quickly as they could. Without a doubt, one of the most thought-provoking of these encounters involved an anonymous caretaker of the ranch, who witnessed several strange lights hovering over one of the fields where cattle were grazing. As he looked on, he could hear strange haunting sounds coming from the field in question. After several minutes, the lights disappeared. The caretaker waited a moment in case they returned before heading over to the field to inspect the cattle. He noticed how the night was strangely silent as he made his way to the meadow. By the time he arrived at the field, he realized why this was. The entire herd had seemingly disappeared. What's more, despite an intense search of the ranch and the land surrounding it, not one of the cattle was ever seen again. It should also perhaps be of little surprise to us that, much like its better-known neighbor, Skinwalker Ranch, Blind Frog Ranch also has many reports of menacing beastly creatures. Many of these reports appear to describe Bigfoot-like figures, tall hairy beasts with particularly long muscular arms, often with glowing red eyes, while others report seeing creatures that are perhaps more akin to the chupacabra reported in South America, Mexico, and in some parts of the United States. Even more bizarre, some people have even reported seeing flying creatures over the ranch that they have described as dinosaur-like birds. While such reports of flying prehistoric birds might sound a little too outlandish for some, the descriptions of these aerial beasts over Blind Frog Ranch match almost perfectly with other reports from other locations. We might ask, if we assume for a moment that sightings of these creatures are credible and genuine, if these apparent dinosaur birds are some kind of undiscovered violent animal, perhaps one left over from the prehistoric age, or where they might be of a supernatural nature, possibly an animal from another dimension or realm of existence that enters our world temporarily. With this last point in mind, it is interesting to note that many of the reports of these strange flying creatures state that they seem to appear out of nowhere and disappear equally as strangely. There are plenty of accounts from Blind Frog Ranch that are decidedly paranormal in nature. There have been, for example, multiple reports of unsettling manifestations and ghostly figures appearing out of nowhere. One particularly chilling account involved a visitor to the ranch. One evening, while he was taking a walk, he saw a strange woman dressed in what he described as an old-fashioned clothing simply appear right in front of him, even though he had been the only person in the area. Not only did this strange woman appear out of nowhere, she walked straight past him before disappearing right before his eyes. This strange ghostly woman was also witnessed by a paranormal investigative team on a different occasion. They not only attested that the woman was wearing clothing that was clearly from a previous age, but that she remained directly in front of them for several moments before she faded away into nothing. Although it isn't clear if it is the same ghostly woman or not. Another paranormal investigative team not only witnessed a shadowy figure dressed in old-fashioned clothing, they managed to capture the apparition on film. They stated that the way the figure moved around the outbuildings, eventually disappearing through one of the walls, appeared to them that they had likely once called the ranch home during their lifetime. As well as apparitions and mysteriously appearing figures, there have also been reports of unnerving screams coming from the woods that surround the land at night. At the same time, people report experiencing sudden feelings of great sadness, anxiety, and even dread, almost as if something otherworldly has entered their minds and taken over their emotions and feelings. We might recall that the group of hikers reported similar feelings as they stood around the mysterious silver metallic sphere in the woods. Also of interest are the many reports from people at Blind Frog Ranch who claim to hear strange whispering coming from nearby, even though there is no one there but themselves. Even more concerning, some people have even reported being pushed or prodded by an invisible assailant, while others have attested to feeling a strange icy breath on the back of their necks as if someone was standing directly behind them. Of course, when they would turn around, there would be no one there. It isn't just the strange and bizarre goings-on and above the land at Blind Frog Ranch. There's plenty of intrigue and subterranean discoveries below the ground. Moreover, many of these discoveries come from vastly different periods of history, suggesting that several different civilizations could have called the land home over a long period of time. While many of these underground discoveries have been identified as belonging to Native American tribes in the region, others are seemingly much older, and more to the point, unexplained. One such discovery is said to be that of a huge stone slab that features ancient Egyptian-style hieroglyphics and symbols intricately carved into it. As strange as these carvings are, the apparent age of the stone slab is also of intrigue, thought to be many thousands of years old, at least. Even stranger, many of these symbols have been found in other subterranean locations around the ranch, suggesting that whatever they mean and whoever made them, they appear to have been of some importance. In fact, one such location is thought by investigative teams to be the ruins of a once great temple complete with stone altars. Once more, discoveries such as these throw open the door to suggestions that an unknown, advanced, ancient civilization might have once called the area home many thousands of years ago. There are certainly other reasons to think this could be the case. As well as the ruins of temples and symbols, an intricate and extensive tunnel system exists below the ranch. These tunnels are also thousands of years old and are clearly man-made, showing parallel planning and execution. Further corroborating this is further Native American knowledge that states the tunnel networks connect several ancient sacred sites that exist on the ranch. Furthermore, some of these tunnels appear to be vast. One investigative team who was attempting to map out these underground networks was forced to turn back after having ventured deep into one of them, when they could see no apparent end in sight nor any light. If an advanced ancient civilization did once exist here, some have suggested that these tunnels could lead to a hall of records type of room featuring ancient knowledge and riches. If an ancient civilization did once call the land Blind Frog Ranch sits on home, then given what we know about other ancient civilizations and their apparent purposeful decisions to construct important buildings near or on naturally occurring energy points, perhaps they too might have been aware of the geological anomalies in the region. The same anomalies, as we mentioned earlier, that scientific teams have recorded there in recent years. In fact, not only have geological anomalies been recorded there, but so have what have been called energy vortexes, perhaps suggesting that some kind of interdimensional gateway or portal exists there. It is also interesting to note that geological anomalies, particularly electromagnetic anomalies, are thought to affect a person's mind, sometimes changing the mood and evoking emotions such as sadness, despair, and even fear. We might recall that many people at the ranch, including the group of hikers, who were suddenly overcome with feelings of anxiety as they watched the metallic orb. It is interesting to note that many people report feeling the same feelings at a Gokara forest, sometimes referred to as a suicide forest, in Japan as well as on the peaks of Ben Macdhu in Scotland, one of the strangest mountains in the world. Are these sudden changes in emotion due to paranormal manipulation, or could they be a consequence of the natural environment? With these last points in mind, it is interesting to note the suggestions of some people that the naturally occurring fault lines or ley lines could run through the land. Not only could these explain the geological anomalies, but many of these lines connect to ancient locations around the world. This would once more suggest that the land could very well have been home to such an ancient civilization, albeit one that has become forgotten to history. And these ley lines could in theory result in the opening of interdimensional gateways where they would cross, so allowing entities from another realm of existence access to our world. The suggestion that the subconscious human made could play a very real part in paranormal activities. Could that also be the case here at Blind Frog Ranch? Could the electromagnetic anomalies somehow interact with a person's mind, not only resulting in a change of emotion, but also in the manifestation of all manner of paranormal entities, dependent on the respective person's own fears, desires, and belief system? Perhaps these geological anomalies temporarily increase the scope of what humans can see on the visible spectrum. As we have mentioned, Blind Frog Ranch resides only a short distance from the better-known Skinwalker Ranch, essentially so close that it sits on the same land, so it perhaps shouldn't surprise us to find that accounts of strange activity can be found in the land between the two ranches. One such account featured the owner of another local, unnamed ranch, who recalled that while he was tending to his cattle one evening, he suddenly noticed a strange hairy creature with glowing red eyes standing a short distance away, staring at him intently. things turned even stranger when the creature just vanished into thin air as the ranch owner looked on in disbelief. Another local woman, whose property resided a short distance from Blind Frog Ranch, reported to investigators hearing strange noises seemingly coming out of the walls of her home. She also reported being woken in the middle of the night by tremendous thudding sounds around her property. She was convinced that these strange happenings were connected to the ranch, elaborating that spirits and mischievous entities had ventured to her home from the land the ranch sat on. Ultimately, much like Skinwalker Ranch, Blind Frog Ranch is one of the strangest, most mystifying locations on the planet. And while events there are very similar to the strange events recorded at its more famous neighbor, there are other ranches in America that are equally as strange but decidedly different. While the events at Blind Frog Ranch are strange and thought-provoking, the alleged activities that unfolded at Stardust Ranch and Rainbow Valley just outside of Phoenix, Arizona in the late 2000s and early 2010s are simply outright bizarre, with a potentially dark undertone to them. Sometimes referred to as Alien Ranch by locals and members of the media, Stardust Ranch, or more specifically the owners, seemingly came under siege by interdimensional alien entities which eventually resulted in the death of one such extraterrestrial creature. The 10-acre ranch in question was purchased by husband and wife John and Joyce Edmonds in 2009, who considered it their dream home. That dream, however, would quickly descend into something more akin to a nightmare. Several weeks after moving into the property, the couple began to notice strange sounds coming from the land surrounding the ranch, particularly late at night. To begin with, the pair put these strange noises down to nothing more than the usual nocturnal sounds of the surrounding Arizona desert. However, when they began seeing bizarrely moving lights in the sky above the desert, they began to suspect they were seeing something far more out of the ordinary. Not long after these strange sounds and lights, the couple began seeing mysterious figures lurking at the very edges of their land, seemingly getting closer to them each night. Eventually, the couple began discovering garden furniture had been moved during the night. They would even on occasion find this furniture dumped into their swimming pool. These already unsettling events took an even stranger turn a short time later. One evening while outside the main house, John and Joyce noticed one of the strange figures again, this time much closer than on previous occasions, so close that they could make out many more details than they had done before, and they could see that this figure was not human. They later described the figure as having a particularly thin frame and an oversized head with two large black eyes. Clearly, they were describing a creature that most of us would liken to a gray alien. As they continued to watch this strange figure, it suddenly disappeared back into the shadows, although they had the distinct feeling that whatever it was, this creature was watching them. This was just the first of several similar sightings that would unfold over the coming weeks, sightings that would ultimately escalate the strange events considerably. It wasn't long before the Edmonds began discovering their horses dead, seemingly attacked during the night. However, rather than the wounds suggesting the respective horses had been attacked by an animal or even a person, they all had wounds that were identical to those found in cattle mutilation cases. Even more harrowing for the couple was the discovery of one of their dogs with similar fatal wounds. As these grisly events were unfolding around the perplexed and increasingly frightened couple, things began to increase intensity once more, and of more concern moved from the perimeters of the land to their property itself. The couple had been hearing unsettling noises coming from right outside the house for several days. One evening, though, while they were each sitting in a comfy chair at the property, one of these curious creatures, albeit very briefly, appeared at the window, looking directly at them as it did so. As truly surreal and frightening as the experience was, the couple did their best to put the incident out of their mind. Over the days that followed, though, they each began discovering strange marks and bruises on their bodies, and even what seemed to be puncture or needle marks. As horrific a thought as it was, they had to face the possibility that these strange creatures, whatever they were entering their property at night and seemingly carrying out some kind of procedures on them. Not long after this, all was confirmed to John. On the evening in question, John awoke in the middle of the night to find Joyce floating above the bed. As he watched in complete shock, She then began to float through the air and out of the bedroom. John continued to watch as whatever force was behind these inexplicable events floated Joyce out of the front door and into the yard. There he could see a hovering object above the property which Joyce was then floated toward. At this point, John wasn't sure if he blacked out due to the surreal nature of the events or if something rendered him unconscious. But the next thing he knew, he awoke in his bed in the morning. Joyce was now back in bed, but John quickly discovered the now familiar marks and bruises on her body. There was now no doubt in his mind. He and Joyce were being repeatedly abducted by what appeared to be alien entities. Realizing he was all but powerless against these potentially dangerous creatures, John began keeping extensive records full of details about their activities. He began noticing that their appearance was almost always accompanied by some kind of high-frequency buzz. This detail eventually led John to conclude that rather than being alien entities, as most of us might understand them, these creatures were likely interdimensional beings. He later stated that the strange buzzing he began noticing was like a side effect of their partial in-phase or out-of-phase interdimensional travel. In other words, the buzzing was like indicative of an open portal or interdimensional gateway. He elaborated that these creatures seemed to enter this partial manifestation when they sense some kind of danger, explaining that he believed they only physically materialized to a point of just crossing through the dimensional threshold, and that they were at this point partially in both dimensions at the same time. He would continue that they would only transcend cleanly into our dimension when there was no immediate danger, and it was at this point he explained that he contemplated this was the perfect opportunity to physically grab one before it attempted to return to its own realm. Several months later, he would put his theory into practice. With the strange mark continuing to appear on both John and Joyce, John made the decision to use the samurai sword that rested above the fireplace. On the night in question, after one of the creatures appeared in the room, John reached for the sword and forced it into the creature's side. A moment later, he withdrew it and raised it above his head, ready to cut off the wounded creature's head. However, before he could do so, right in front of him, the creature disappeared into thin air. This led John to several further conclusions. He put forward that he had likely fatally wounded the being, but it still had enough time to reopen the gateway and return to its own dimension. He suggested that the creature's head controls the ability to control the dimensional transference between one place and another. This, he further explained, was the reason he was attempting to cut off the creature's head, as this was the only way to definitely kill the creature and to ensure its body remained in our dimension. As we might imagine, many were more than suspicious about these events, and noted how convenient it was that the wounded creature disappeared. However, it soon became to light that although the creature itself had disappeared, John had managed to obtain blood and tissue samples that he retrieved from the sword. John further offered that he had the blood and tissue samples analyzed, with the results showing that they were unknown to science, with no connections to humans or any known animal. When it came to light, though, that the person who performed these tests and had the samples, A.W.C. Leavenworth, had allegedly disappeared, suspicions were raised once more. Levengood. John began speaking of these strange encounters on social media, eventually claiming that he had killed or injured around 20 of these interdimensional beings, even injuring himself during one of these encounters. It appeared the more he spoke of the events, the more intense the attacks became, and perhaps of more concern around the same time as the social media post on the bizarre goings-on, John claimed to have received several visits from the men in black. As John continued to make his claims, he began to get the attention of various newspapers and media platforms, with the pair even appearing on several news programs and television shows. And this newfound attention only served to raise suspicions even further about the couple's claims, with one platform in particular making some dark suggestions as to the possible reality of the situation. Brian Franch and Phoebe Tyers, who discussed the case on the podcast Unbelievable, they would point out, rightly or wrongly, that many of Joyce's claims of interactions with these alien entities appeared to revolve around sexual assault. Franch even asked if it was possible that John Edmonds was abusing his wife, possibly while she slept, and then blaming it on aliens. He continued that it was even possible that John had convinced himself that aliens really were abducting his wife as some kind of subconscious defense mechanism against his speculative abuse. Ultimately, Frank concluded that he believed that John was telling the truth as he thinks it is, but the real truth might be something else. We should make clear that John Edmonds himself dismissed such claims that he was behind his wife's bruises, and he rejected the notion that he had subconsciously manufactured the accounts to cover up his abuse. Whatever the truth of the matter, as the 2010s came to a close, the Edmonds looked to finally sell the ranch. However, even this seemingly innocent move was the cause of controversy, or at least for some. It was noted that the asking price of the ranch was around the $5 million mark, a substantial increase from the $1.7 million it was listed at when the Edmonds first purchased it. Ultimately, some people began to suggest that the entire story was one the pair had orchestrated to gain financially, not only from the television appearances, but from selling the ranch at a price well above its actual value. Despite the suspicion of many, it is worth noting that John Edmonds didn't once change his story or alter any of the details of the events he claimed took place at Stardust Ranch, right up to his death in February 2022. He did offer further thoughts and theories of the strange happenings, though. He offered, for example, not long before his death, that he believed some kind of gateway or portal existed on the land of the ranch, and it was portals such as these that allowed these entities access to our world. This notion, as we shall see, will come again. Another ranch with undoubtedly strange activity is Clearwater Ranch, which can be found in the nearby state of Colorado. As detailed by UFO researcher and author Timothy Good, the Evans family, who owned the ranch during the 1970s, had noticed strange lights and bizarre activity taking place in the land for years. This activity appeared to grow in intensity throughout much of 1976, with Jim Evans, the official ranch owner, even finding several of his cattle dead and mutilated without explanation. On one particular evening in January 1977, after again noticing mysterious lights and questionable activity on the perimeters of the ranch, as well as the sighting of a large, hairy, Bigfoot-like creature, only the previous evening, Jim, along with his eldest son Joe, headed to the woodland which bordered on the land. The closer they got, the more clearly they could see a bright yellow light coming from the trees. After bringing their vehicle to a stop, Jim and Joe got out and cautiously headed toward the source of the light. They soon found themselves in a clearing, and in front of them was a bizarre black box. They could also hear a gentle but persistent humming sound that appeared to emanate from the box. They took several steps toward it. As they did so, however, the low buzzing sound began to increase in intensity, eventually sounding more like a swarm of angry bees. Noticing that this buzzing increased seemingly with each step the pair took, Jim and Joe came to a sudden stop before they backed away from the clearing completely. After arriving back at the car, Jim told Joe to remain with the vehicle while he took one last look at the clearing. A little uneasy, Joe agreed, and Jim ventured off toward the woods. Upon arriving at the clearing, however, the box and the yellow glow were nowhere to be seen. He looked around for several moments before returning to the car. Perplexed as he was, Jim drove the pair back to the main house. A short time later, however, Jim noticed the yellow glow once more, and upon doing so, he immediately jumped back in the car and made his way back to the clearing. This time, two mysterious men were waiting for him. The two men, each dressed in a dark suit that seemed to change color from a golden brown to a surreal silver color, appeared to be standing inside the light, which Jim recalled as not emanating from anywhere in particular, but also coming from everywhere all around them. This is an interesting detail that can be found in many UFO and close encounter reports. The notion of no source lighting that appears to come from nowhere but everywhere at the same time, almost as if it came from the surrounding themselves. We might ask if this is the same kind of technology at work here. It was as Jim was studying this strange light that he noticed a disc-shaped object hovering just above the ground around 50 feet behind the two men. As strange as the evening had so far proven to be, things were about to turn even stranger. One of the men began speaking to Jim, apologizing for the strange goings-on at the ranch, and even apologizing for the troubles Jim had been having, and stating that they would look to find a more equitable arrangement. This, of course, heavily suggested that they were somehow connected to the strange and unsettling events the Evans family had witnessed. Following this, one of the men gestured behind Jim and instructed him to turn around. When he did, he could see a large Bigfoot standing there, almost exactly the same as the large hairy figure he had witnessed the previous evening. The men informed him that this creature obeyed their commands. As if to prove this, they then motioned towards the creature. As soon as they did so, the Bigfoot began walking directly towards a black box that Jim had not noticed previously, but that was the same type of black box he and Joe had seen only a short time earlier. And, as it had done earlier, as the creature moved toward it, a low buzzing quickly increased with intensity with every step. As this was happening, one of the men offered to Jim that he had been correct to step away from the box earlier. Then, as the Bigfoot creature was directly in front of the black box, it suddenly dropped to the ground in a lifeless heap. The man then stated to Jim, as he had just witnessed, the box was quite deadly. As Jim watched these surreal and harrowing events unfolding, he had a sudden feeling that he should leave immediately. And this wasn't merely a feeling of fear of survival. He later stated that it was as if these instructions had been placed inside his head, most likely by the two mysterious men. While saying a word, he backed away a little before turning around and heading quickly to his car. He returned home more than dazed at what he had witnessed, and still at a loss as to what was taking place on his land. Whether coincidence or not, the sightings of bizarre lights and the discovery of mutilated cattle to suddenly become a few and far between following this encounter, although they didn't stop entirely. Jim never received an explanation as to who the two men were or what exactly they were doing on his land, nor did he know what the connection was to the Bigfoot creature, as well as the disappearing and mutilated livestock. Indeed, the encounter leaves us with many questions. Just who were the two men, and for what organization, if any, did they work? What connection did they have to the strange lights, often witnessed by the Evans family? And what was the connection to the futuristic disc-shaped object that had hovered behind them? And just how did they connect to the Bigfoot Jim witnessed, and for what purpose? Could these strange creatures have been extraterrestrials themselves, or might they have been something more akin to the men in black? Perhaps most intriguing, what was a black box, and how does it fit into the strange goings-on at Clearwater Ranch? Perhaps one thing to consider is that this strange box was some kind of device, perhaps one that manipulated energy and opened portals or gateways. As we have seen the presence of at our previous two ranches we explored, that has also been noted at the more famous Skinwalker Ranch. At this point, it's worth pausing for a moment and examining the location of the ranches we have explored so far. Comprised of Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado, this part of the United States is known as the Four Corners, and it is arguably one of the most mysterious and paranormally active parts of America, with each state having an abundance of UFO sightings and reports of other strange and anomalous activity. NASA has recently taken an interest in the Four Points region, with the official reason being unexplained high emissions of methane being detected there. However, given the plethora of strange goings-on there, some people have questioned just what the real reason might be for such an interest. While the above ranches all reside in the Four Corners district of the United States, and they certainly do appear to have their own exclusive abundance of activity, claims, and conspiracies, there are plenty of other ranches that are home to all manner of paranormal activity in the United States. Perhaps one of the most active of this can be found in the Lone Star State of Texas, the Blanco County Ranch in Blanco County, approximately 50 miles west of Austin. Like Skinwalker Ranch and Blind Frog Ranch, it appears the land Blanco County resides on was once home to several Native American tribes many hundreds of years ago. So it perhaps shouldn't surprise us to find connections to Native American legends and the strange encounters that have unfolded at the ranch. Although the exact date isn't known, one day in the late 1990s or early 2000s, John Villarreal was hiking in the woodlands around the ranch with his friend Corey Ramser and a friend who wished only to be referred to as BC. At some point during the hike, although he wasn't certainly certain how, John had become separated from the other two men, and it was as he was separated from them that something truly bizarre occurred. He began to see intense visions in his mind of a wolf running through the mountains. This vision remained clear in his mind for several seconds before he came out of the trance-like grip and scanned his surroundings. Needless to say, he was more than shocked to find himself looking directly at a large wolf that was standing on a ledge nearby. He locked stares with the beast for several moments before it suddenly leaped from the ledge, heading straight for him. Before he knew what was happening, the wolf was on his chest. However, then things turned even stranger. As opposed to a wild, vicious attack, John felt a strange chilling sensation as the wolf seemingly passed straight through him. Then he must have blacked out. The next thing John recalled was Corey and BC finding him beneath the ledge where the wolf had been standing. His friend claimed they found him in an almost trance-like state, and that they had to assist him to his feet. They brought him back to their vehicle and set off back to the ranch. They had positioned John in between themselves in the front seat of the truck in order to help him stay upright. Each of them later recalled that they could feel the cold coming from their friend, with Corey likening it to sitting next to a block of ice. When they finally arrived at the ranch, an already bizarre and strange evening turned even stranger. By the time the owner of the ranch, Bert Wall, arrived, John was back in a complete trance, speaking in a language that appeared to be a mixture of Apache and Spanish. When an elder arrived at the ranch in an attempt to translate just what he was saying, however, it appeared to be factually and historically accurate. What's more, the elder offered that much of what he was saying he simply couldn't have known through conventional means. For example, he stated that John was giving detailed accounts of battles and massacres that were not widely known about outside of the Native American community. Similarly, he offered details about ambush methods and traps used by many Native American tribes hundreds of years earlier. This continued for several hours before things turned even stranger still. Although the evening was clear with no adverse weather, a sudden gust of wind burst through the property, so strong in fact that it blew open several doors inside the house. What's more, it appeared as though this wind had moved through several rooms of the house before it left the property several seconds after it had appeared. Almost as soon as it had done so, John appeared to snap out of his trance and return to his normal self. The elder stated that he believed that a spirit in the form of a wolf had possessed him when it had leaped down from the ledge and had remained in control of him for several hours. It is perhaps interesting to note the legends of the skinwalker that is said, also according to Native American legend, to roam the land Skinwalker Ranch sits on, manifesting itself in any form it chooses. Could this be another case of the skinwalker here at Blanco County Ranch, one that took temporary possession of John Villarreal? It certainly isn't the only strange encounter that has been reported from the ranch. The owner, Bert Wall, found himself in the middle of several inexplicable events during the course of his time there. Undoubtedly, one of the most unsettling occurred late one evening, around midnight. John was at his desk writing when he heard his dog suddenly begin to bark agitatedly. He looked in the direction the dog was focused on, the window. To his shock and disbelief, on the other side of the glass was the figure of a monk dressed in what he described as 18th century clothing. The figure remained there for several seconds before simply fading into nothing. Fascinated by what he had seen, Bert researched the ranch and the area around it, and discovered that a Franciscan monk named Espinosa had once lived on the land during the 1700s. Another unnerving encounter involved a one-time foreman of the ranch, Lynn Gentry. One evening he was awoken by the sound of multiple horses seemingly galloping past his front door. To his shock, when he opened the door, he could see horse after horse going past, each with a Confederate soldier on its back. An entire unit passed by before vanishing into the night as if they had never been there. Yet another disturbing report came from John Myers, who was hunting deer on the land when he found himself in a most surreal situation. According to Myers, he had positioned himself in one of the many tree stands in the woodland and remained there waiting for a deer to wander past. He remained there where he was for several hours, with nothing at all walking past his lookout. Then he heard the sounds of footsteps coming from below him. However, rather than being the feet of a deer, they sounded distinctly human, and of more concern, they sounded as if they were heading in his direction. He continued to listen to the footsteps for several more moments before they came to a sudden stop. Although he didn't look down, John could almost feel that whoever or whatever was behind the footsteps, they were now standing at the base of the tree he was sitting in. He decided to remain as quiet as possible in the hope that whoever was responsible for the footstep sounds would soon leave. He wasn't sure how long he waited, but as the temperature continued to drop, the later it got. He realized that he would have to climb down from the tree stand and attempt to make a run for it. He leaned over from the stand and looked down below, unable to see anyone or anything there. As quietly and cautiously as he could, he began to descend toward the ground. He quickly scanned his surroundings and, satisfied he was alone, he quickly headed out of the woodland. However, several moments later, after having taken only several steps, he had a sudden urge to look back to his right. When he did so, a short distance away in line with him was a Native American man simply standing there watching him. John noted that despite the almost icy cold of the night, the Native American wore only trousers and was completely unclothed from the waist up. Moreover, he seemed completely unfazed and unaffected by the cold temperature. The two men simply looked at each other for several moments before John decided to begin walking forward once more. As he did so, though, the Native American man walked with him, keeping the same distance from him but matching him step for step. After taking several more steps, John stopped once more, as did the Native American, all the while not taking his gaze from John. At this point, John decided to approach the ghostly figure. However, no sooner had he taken a step than the figure simply vanished into thin air. Was this another kind of manifestation that had chosen to take the form of a Native American tribesman? Or could it have been, as John himself believed, the ghost of a Native American warrior who once called the land home? We might also ask what the reason for this interaction was in the first place. If we accept that the strange footsteps heard by John earlier in the night were the footsteps of the Native American, rather than him simply appearing by chance through some kind of otherworldly coincidence, he appeared there for a reason and with a purpose. Could he have taken exception to John hunting on the land, and so wanted to ensure he left? Or could he have been there to protect John from danger of some kind? Of course, if the latter was true, then the fact that the Native American spirit seemingly succeeded in this task means we will never learn what that danger might have been. If we return to one of the states of the Four Corners, Colorado, we can find two other ranches that are equally as strange in terms of bizarre goings-on and activity. Sandstone Ranch in Longmont, Colorado, for example, was a long-running active ranch until it was finally sold to the city in 1990 and ultimately turned into a resource and visitor center. As we might imagine, with such a long history behind it, there could very well be a ghost or two that calls the land home, and at least according to many of the employees and tourists who have visited the ranch since its conversion, this is very much the case. Many employees, for example, have reported sudden temperature changes in various rooms of the property, as well as unsettling noises coming from out of nowhere. Equally as strange are the lights that sometimes flicker on and off at random, as well as a higher than usual number of electronic equipment and devices that suddenly malfunction. Perhaps even more unnerving are reports from staff who have locked the bedroom doors of the ranch at night before closing as instructed, only for them to be found wide open the following day when the premises are opened. One particularly interesting encounter and report came from a tourist to the ranch who claimed she was a psychic and could often see the spirits of those who had passed away. She claimed that while she was at the ranch, she saw what she described as the spirit of a distressed young woman who was desperately unhappy. This woman, she claimed, roamed the ranch and was at least partially responsible for the many strange events reported there. How accurate this psychic might have been remains open to debate. But the bizarre activity continues to be reported from Sandstone Ranch even today. Also in Colorado, this time in Genesee, we can find Buffalo Ranch, which has its own unsettling resume of paranormal encounters and activity. According to Jason Homola, whose father was once the caretaker of the ranch, he experienced several strange incidents when he was a child at the ranch. Without a doubt, one of the strangest occurred one evening when he was 12 years old. On the night in question, he was sitting with his father, and they both suddenly heard his mother screaming out loud in absolute terror. At exactly the same time, their pet dog began barking furiously. He and his father rushed upstairs immediately. Upon arriving there, they discovered the dog barking at the wall, while his mother simply looked in the same direction in shock. She eventually told them that she had seen a glowing green orb suddenly appear out of nowhere in the room before it floated through the air and disappeared into the wall. This was far from the only strange incident at the ranch. Around 6 months after the encounter with the green orb, Jason was asleep in his room when his father woke him in the middle of the night, wanting to know if he could hear music playing. Although he was half asleep, Jason listened for a moment. He could indeed hear the sounds of a lonely violin playing somewhere in the distance. Jason accompanied his father around the house, checking all the radios and televisions to ensure the music couldn't be coming from any of them. All of them were switched off. Even stranger, no matter which room of the house they were in, the music remained at the same volume. neither getting louder nor quieter. Ultimately, they couldn't locate the source of the music, and it eventually faded away. They could, however, hear it several more times on random nights over the next several months. It wasn't until several years later that the pair discovered a possible explanation for the haunting melody. After reading a book about the area by a local historian, Jason learned that the Patrick family owned the ranch in the 19th century. Part of the Patrick family consisted of two brothers, one who one day in 1870 got into an intense argument over the family's pet dog. So intense, in fact, that one brother was shot dead by the other. Moreover, the deceased boy had been a talented, albeit amateur violinist, and was often found playing his violin around the ranch. As we might imagine, it didn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to connect these details to the strange and haunting music Jason and his father had heard several times throughout the ranch. It is also worth our time to briefly explore Bonnie Spring Ranch just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. Although it was built relatively recently in the 1950s, some researchers and investigators claim it is one of the most haunted locations in the Silver State. According to the owners of the ranch, there are regular reports of strange manifestations around the building, including that of a young girl who most often appears at the old schoolhouse of the ranch. Another, perhaps more unsettling figure is that of a shadowy mass or form that is witnessed near the opera house. Many people have also reported hearing strange noises and even voices coming from out of nowhere even though there is nobody there. Perhaps interestingly, some researchers who have investigated these strange encounters at Bonnie Spring Ranch have offered that the land it now resides on was once part of the route for people traveling from east to west in the 19th century, with this region in particular being a hub of sorts for wagons to stop. However, many of those who did make it this far were at the point of exhaustion, with many people dying there. Could this be the reason there is such ghostly activity at the ranch today? We should perhaps also mention Bradshaw Ranch in Sedona, Arizona, an apparent hive of strange activity that was detailed in the book Merging Dimensions, The Opening Portals of Sedona by Linda Bradshaw and Tom Dongo. In the 1990s, the ranch, located just outside of Sedona in the Verde Valley, was owned by John Bradshaw, the son of Hollywood stuntman Bob Bradshaw, and his wife Linda. Beginning sometime in 1992, they began to notice and record strange happenings there. Linda began to report seeing strange orbs of light over the ranch, similar perhaps to the strange orbs reported at Stardust Ranch around 20 years later, as well as bizarre flashes from overhead. More ominously, and again similarly to the goings-on at Stardust Ranch, Linda began to witness strange shadowy figures around the property out of the corner of her eye. These sightings would then seem to escalate somewhat to her reporting seeing actual alien entities outside of her window. She described these entities as a typical gray alien, each wearing a tight-fitting one-piece uniform just strolling past the window. The following day, she and her son went out to investigate and discovered strange footprints in the ground exactly where she had seen the creature walking. As if these events were not strange enough, Linda also detailed seeing Bigfoot-like creatures on the land and even a lizard-like creature that walked upright, standing around 5 feet tall and leaving reptilian-like prints in the earth where it had been. What is interesting is that Linda came to a conclusion reached by many UFO researchers years later, that all these events were linked and were likely the result of some kind of portal or interdimensional gateway that allows various entities to enter our realm of existence. She elaborated that these portals had likely been here for as long as the planet itself had and were likely not the only ones on Earth. As we might imagine, Linda Bradshaw would soon begin receiving increased attention from news and television stations off the back of her claims, and the ranch itself became the focus of paranormal investigators and enthusiasts. One thing that was noticed under this increased scrutiny was the land the ranch sat on showed several electromagnetic anomalies, and we might imagine that these anomalies, if only in part, were responsible for at least some of the strange encounters witnessed by Linda Bradshaw. What made the matter all the more intriguing was that in the summer of 2003, the land and ultimately the ranch was purchased by the United States government, essentially putting it off limits to the public. It wasn't long before signs telling people to keep out went up around the perimeter of the land, with some people even reporting a discreet military presence there keeping guard. Tom Dongo even collected several reports from people who wandered onto the land by mistake while hiking of being confronted by heavily armed uniformed personnel and being escorted off the land under threat of being shot. Just why the government wished to purchase the land remains unknown, but it is easy to see why some people, given the abundance of strange activity reported there, would find the move a little eyebrow raising. It is perhaps easy to assume that one black budget agency or another would wish to study the phenomena, likely to weaponize it, or perhaps it pertains to the UFO activity there, and is part of what some people believe to be the greatest cover-up in human history. Today the ranch sits in overgrown vegetation and is all but inaccessible, perhaps just the way the government wants it. As we can see, then, many ranches across the United States, other than Skinwalker Ranch, are awash with paranormal activity. And these are just some of the many locations we could have explored here. You might ask then, what the reason might be for such anomalous incidents taking place at different ranches across America. Could it be the fact that many of them, the vast majority, in fact, will be built on land that once was home to great civilizations, in some cases Native American, in other cases perhaps civilizations that are unknown to us, and go back even further. Perhaps if we accept that both Native American and speculative unknown civilizations were aware of the electromagnetic anomalies in these regions and knew how to harness them, these locations might have been places of importance in both the distant and, relatively speaking, more recent past. Only further study of these regions will offer us answers to these questions. What will we likely find is that as well as offering answers to many paranormal mysteries and the true nature of our collective reality, understanding these enigmas could tell us a lot more about human and planetary history. Indeed, we just might find that the truly bizarre and curious events of the modern world could lift the curtain on currently hidden and unknown events of the past. And there you go. And I will soon be back with more interesting eerie news. Till next time, take care.